Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter. A few details about this podcast before we get started. Details about this podcast episode and more can be found at zachbitter.com. My website is where you can find all details about the podcast, including episode notes, links, timestamps, and a full transcript. You can also find my social media channels and newsletter sign up there. If you want to support the show and also gain access to an intro and ad-free audio version of every episode, as well as early release, consider joining the show Patreon page. You can also access my coaching services, which include my virtual group coaching package, products that I use, my Amazon storefront, which highlights a wide range of training and racing items that I use. Please consider sharing episodes you like on social media, liking, commenting, and writing a review. It really goes a long way in reaching new listeners. As a way to thank listeners who engage, I am raffling a 30-minute consultation with me every month for anyone who shares, leaves comments, and reviews the podcast. Just remember to tag me or send an email to hpopodcast@gmail.com to let me know if I'm not already tagged, so I can add you to the raffle. Also, if you have suggestions for show topics or guests, you can also send those to that email address as well. Finally, a big thanks to S Fuels, John G, Delta G Ketones, and Element Electrolytes for sponsoring this podcast. Links and discounts to these brands can be found in the show notes as well as at zachbitter.com. I also left a more formal description of each of these brands at the end of the episode. All right, let's get into the show. Glad you reached out. I was actually wondering if we maybe crossed paths. And when I was looking at some of your stuff, I was thinking, I think I might have actually maybe met you at JFK one year. What years did you do JFK?
I've been there. My first year was 2017, and I've been there pretty much every year since, outside of 2022.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so I probably was there the same year you were at 2019.
Okay.
I've done JFK 3 times, but I did a few pretty early, a couple times, 2011 and 2012, and then it took me a while to get back, but 2019 was the next time. But
yeah, cool. I was totally there then, so
that's funny. Yeah. I want to get into like your entire story and everything, because it's just like a fascinating story and just achievement in general. But maybe we can just kick things off with you giving the listeners a little bit of a background on kind of what your kind of early life was like, that kind of led you down the path you're heading right now, and then we can dive into some of the exciting things you've been up to over the last few years.
Yeah, cool. Great. I grew up in a really small town in southern Indiana, so not a lot of exposure outside of those 450 people. And then at the age of 18, I joined the military. I was in the Air Force. And at the age of 19, I ended up in northern Japan, which was a complete culture shock to me. Just as you can imagine, a 19-year-old kid going from a small, non-diverse town to living in a foreign country with people who speak a foreign language was just it was an eye-opening experience for me. And I think really set the stage early from that point in my life to really embrace challenge, to be able to like work through challenge and learn from other people, and a very different environment than I was used to. So, those first 6 months, I was very scared, culture shocked, not really understanding or knowing what to expect. But after the 6 months or so period, I really embraced that and loved what I was doing, loved where I was at, loved who I was working with and interacting with. And for the next 8 years, I spent living overseas because of that very influential period of my life. So I lived in Japan for 6 years, and Korea for a year, and Turkey for a little over a year, and eventually came back to Little Rock, Arkansas for my next duty assignment. And from Little Rock, I deployed to Afghanistan in 2007. And then I was doing the job in the Air Force called Explosive Ordnance Disposal, which is the men and women who go into combat environments and basically disarm roadside bombs. And we work with other hazardous explosive devices, but mainly in combat, we're, removing and making safe these hazards from the battlefield so that local populations can live safely, and so that our troops can have freedom of movement and not being having the fear of being injured. And I did that job for 11 years. And during this deployment in Afghanistan in 2007, I was working on a device similar to what I've done hundreds of times before. And really in an instant, there was a second device that went off that I didn't know about. And it really changed my life in that moment forever.
Yeah, I mean there's like so many directions you could go with that. I mean, it's like obviously it's life changing. Uh, when you, I kind of want to get into just like the catalyst of that job in general. I mean, I'm aware of it, and I know there are people who do it, but what was it like when you're in the Air Force? Was it something where you signed up, said I'll take that on, or were you assigned to that type of a job? Like, what was the lifestyle like, kind of going into a day knowing, okay, I'm really working a pretty dangerous job in terms of just, was it something where every time you went in, you were like, all right, well, this could go badly at some point, and there's kind of a zero mistake margin type of a profession, or is it something you just end up normalizing to some degree until a scenario like yours happens?
Yeah, great question and great awareness. When I entered the career field, it was 1997. I was an 18-year-old kid, so as you can imagine, it was prior to the wars, prior to September 11th. And as an 18-year-old kid, they gave me a list of jobs that I tested into or qualified for, and one of those was EOD. And as an 18-year-old kid, like blowing stuff up and working with explosives and doing all, it sounded very cool at the time. And there were no wars ongoing. And it just sounded like a really incredible job for an 18-year-old kid. And then I took that sheet, I signed the sheet and then took it home to my parents, and my mom's reading it like, oh, works with weapons of mass destruction and nuclear devices. And my mom was like, what the heck did you get into? But, as I entered the career field, I met a lot of incredible people who have been doing it for a long time and mentored me through that process. And we did an immense amount of training to be prepared for those scenarios, but there wasn't anything on the horizon at the time. So yeah, you're right. When 2011 or 2000, September 11th, 2001 kicked off, we were put into those combat environments on the training that we had been doing for several years leading up to this. And as that started to happen, yeah, I saw people around me who I knew and had worked with being injured and unfortunately dying in some circumstances. And that started to really bring the reality around that of what could happen. And a lot of times going into, at least during my first deployment was 2004 in Baghdad, and going into that environment, yeah, you do think potentially if I make a mistake, I could, end up giving my life. And that's what I signed up for, but, it doesn't make it any less of a reality or challenge going into those environments. But in all honesty, I never imagined myself being injured to the extent I was, and then having to live through that and what was next after that. Right. So I think going into it, I was a little bit, had a little bit rose colored glasses going into it, it was like all or nothing, gray or white, or black or white. But yeah, a scenario happened to me that I didn't expect in a million years. And in an instant, my life did change and change towards something I wasn't necessarily prepared for. And that's really where the work began, of working through that and understanding what happened and kind of figuring it out, really.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a really interesting like mindset or psychology to me, because when I think of just like sport and athletics in general, it's like you get these individuals who tend to be able to really kind of block out a lot or compartmentalize, or you'll see something happen in their life, or just the day to day of someone being like super famous. If we're talking about like top tier athletes in the world with big name sports and things like that, they just have this like ability to sort of just like turn everything off and focus on the task at hand, and then go back to whatever's there afterwards and deal with it. And I wonder about that with like a profession like that too, where you almost have to have that similar mindset of like, all right, well, this is the job. I know the risks that this entails, and they could be severe, but then once you get doing it, you sort of almost like get into a state or a mental state of just like focusing on that and not thinking about some of that stuff, I would imagine.
Yeah, I think that's a great observation. It was very compartmentalized, and that is a benefit when you're in those tough environments. And I think it's a detriment when you're outside of those environments trying to like have relationships and friendships, and you're compartmentalizing and shutting off different parts of your brain so that you can survive in those circumstances, right? So we hear a lot about post-traumatic stress disorder and people who have been in those situations, and our brain becomes very good of compartmentalizing and shutting things off that could affect us, could affect how we do the job, and keeping us as safe as possible. And then really that transition period once you leave that environment and getting back into society and transitioning after leaving the military, I think that's where it's a detriment, right? And to your point of those athletes, they become very good at it. And then once they transition past their career or after their career, I think it can be a learning experience to find out who they are after the career and what's next. And you hear a lot of talk about people retired and then trying to find their new purpose and their new why and their new who they are in that moment, right? And I think that's happened for me in that scenario, and happens for a lot of military members once they get back and transition out and try to figure out, who am I now and what do I do now?
Yeah, that's a really good point. You have a similar scenario there where when you retire or you step away from whether it's a professional sport or the military, you're still relatively young in most cases compared to like the average retiree where, they may be at a point in their life where it's like, okay, I've got this transition, but I'm like, like in my 60s, 70s, maybe even. And then it's just like they're at kind of more of the twilight stages of their life versus being like, maybe in your late 30s, early 40s, and having a huge chunk of your life left in front of you and having to kind of like, reinvent yourself. It's a very interesting kind of scenario that just doesn't necessarily fit the mold of society as the rest of society in a lot of cases. So those type of people oftentimes I think probably do struggle to kind of like fit in. Where do they, it must kind of feel like you're jumping in to everyone else's lifestyle when they're already like, like a decade plus, 2 decades plus into it already, and feeling like, okay, I got to catch back up now and make up for the time I was away, kind of, because it's sort of a compartmentalized lifestyle.
Yeah, totally. And we just had the Olympics and the Paralympics happen, and those athletes trained for 4 years for that one day or one event. And, and there's that pretty famous documentary called The Way to Gold, and it talks about the life post-Olympic, and kind of that down state or that depressive state after you've trained your entire life for this one event and it's over. And now what do I do now? Who am I now? What's next? And some people transition better than others. And, for me, it took 7 years to get to that point where I felt, maybe as mentally recovered as I was physically recovered. And that was like a whole learning process in itself. And once I started to kind of figure that out, then I was able to start building on that. But yeah, it took a long time for me personally to get there.
Yeah. Have you, I think I saw on your website, are you affiliated with Team Red, White, and Blue?
I am. So I would love to talk about them, and they were a huge part of that transition, but what is your connection with them?
Yeah. So I actually just had Mike Irwin on the podcast a few episodes ago, and I actually met Mike a long time ago. It was probably in like 2011, actually after JFK 50 mile. He had reached out to me and one of the other runners there, David Riddle, and just said, hey, I've got this idea I'm trying to kind of get into motion, where we kind of create this community where we take like people from the running community and people who know a lot about running and the ins and outs of that community, and then we pair them with veterans who are returning. At that time too, it was like there was a pretty big flux of men and women returning from like Iraq, Afghanistan, and a lot of the stuff around that. So he put together a big camp down in southern Texas that got really big. Actually, I think at one point it had maybe a couple hundred plus people that would attend it, and it was a kind of like a split between civilians and veterans. And he just moved that whole program so fast. I've stayed in touch with him ever since. So I'm always I always catches my eye when I see the Team RWB symbol on someone's page or hear that they were affiliated with them in some shape or form.
Yeah, I love that, and I love that organization. And I think maybe you're talking about Band of Runners and Liza Howard. Is that the camp you're talking about? Or
yeah, so that camp actually had a little bit of a transition. Okay. It was originally just I'm trying to think what they called it originally. It might have just been the Team RWB name and logo, but then when they kind of grew and started kind of to expand outside of just running and get into like all sorts of fitness and activities and lifestyle type stuff, they wanted to keep that going, but they wanted to kind of keep it in a little bit of or do it a little bit differently than they had historically. And then they kind of transitioned it over to Band of Runners is kind of what I've been told.
Gotcha. Totally. And, I think this is a good point to maybe talk about that transition period of my life where, I picked up my running prosthetic in April 2015. And I was trying to look for those connections I had from the military, those like positive, that positive community. and I connected with Team RWB. I was living in Washington, D.C. at the time, and just reached out probably 3 or 4 weeks into my running journey, and I was running really slow, and just reached out to them. I was like, hey, do you mind if I join you for a run? I'm really slow. I'm probably going to be back in the pack, but they welcomed me with open arms. And it's a lot of times it's less about running and more about that community building, as you mentioned, and the community connection between the military and the civilian counterparts that the military are integrating back into or reintegrating back into. And I think their organization does a great job of making those connections and helping military members reintegrate into their communities and really understand that there's so many people there that can play a positive influence and be a positive part of your community once you go home.
Yeah, for sure. Were you a runner or an athlete before your incident?
I hated running, and I grew up playing soccer and mainly ball sports. Which, playing those sports, your punishment is to go run. So you grow to hate it. And then I had a friend who I played soccer with, and he invited me out to the track team. And I was like, I do not run. I hate running. And he was like, we're high jumping. We don't have to run that much. So I was like, okay, that sounds cool. So I high jumped and long jumped a little bit. And then, you join the military and they're forcing you to run again. Right. So it's the weekly physical training, the PT tests that you're going out and having to run to prove your fitness standards. And it's just, again, forced on you. And I to be honest, I didn't love it. I did it. I was okay at it. But, in 2007, when that was taken away from me, or at least I thought it was taken away from me, it brings a whole new meaning to the ability to go run and the ability to just go do something that you take for granted almost every day. And in 2015, I started to grow to love running. And then I really embraced it around that time. And the more I did it and the more I realized the ability to do it and that it wasn't taken away from me, it was more a self-imposed limitation for those 7 years. I really embraced it and just became grateful of that ability to go out and run again. And from there, it's just been, a constant in my life over the past 9.5 years at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. When it first happened, was there like a shock period when, like, obviously the explosion and you pretty quickly, I would imagine, that like something's wrong and you need help. But as you're kind of going through those hours and maybe days, what are you thinking about during that? Are you even considering next steps, or are you just kind of in shock, I guess?
There's so much unknown, and I think in shock is a great way to put it. The unknown, the uncertainty, as I mentioned previously, that wasn't something I imagined in a million years, that outcome. So there are so many thoughts going through your mind while you're laying in the hospital bed those first few days and first few moments, because I was awake through my entire incident. And yeah, I think uncertainty, unknown, shock, all those are great ways to put it. And the mental thoughts and emotions that are spiraling through your mind are countless. And for me, none of those really look like, am I going to be able to run or do any, like, I thought maybe I was going to be in a wheelchair. I had no idea at that point. But where it really first started to come to realization was when I got back to Walter Reed. I had 2 or 3 surgeries in Germany after my injury, amputated my leg, some surgeries to basically stabilize me and get my arm in a good place, because I had some arm injuries to my arm as well. And then when you get back to Walter Reed, you're seeing other individuals who had similar experiences, and they're in the physical training area, the PT area, walking, and some of them are running, and some of them are cycling and rollerblading, and just doing, a wide range of things that are that then you start putting the pieces together. Oh, I can see concretely what this person who is 6 months out from the same injury that I have, what they're doing at that moment. So then I think that really got the wheels turning of, okay, maybe there is some hope. Maybe there is some things that I'll be able to do that I didn't necessarily expect when I was day one in the hospital bed. And that's when I really started to put the pieces together and start to think more about long-term, as opposed to, okay, I'm just surviving at this point.
Yeah, that's interesting to think about, because my first thought was just like you're sort of on this maybe dark solo journey where it's like you probably don't know a lot of people, that certainly not relative timeline in the same position as you are, but you're in a scenario where you're actually kind of almost seeing a scaffolding of just like, oh, like you said, this person is a similar situation 6 months out, so maybe that's a target, or that person's cycling, that person's rollerblading, that person's running. Maybe those are options that I have versus just thinking like, wondering maybe like, is there anything for me after this from a physical standpoint, or am I going to have to just kind of be in a situation I never imagined for the rest of my life?
Totally. And there's like a good and bad of being in Walter Reed. It's horrible that there were so many people there like me that were coming back injured like I was. But the support and resources at that hospital were like no other. And I didn't really realize that until, I mean, I realized it at the time, but what really cemented it in my mind was the prosthetist who was making my legs, my prosthetic legs, was also an amputee himself. And he lost his leg when he was 19 years old and was recovering in a civilian hospital. And most of the peers around him, or most of the other amputees around him, were older individuals who had lost their legs to like diabetes or, circulation issues. And he said it wasn't for 3 years until he found or met someone his own age. And he was like in a really dark spot. And as you mentioned, that isolation piece of being alone in that spot is one of the hardest spots to dig out of. And that's where he was, because he didn't have those people around me like I did, or those support from organizations like I did. And that's what really kind of made a light bulb go off in my head of, wow, this is horrible. And I'm grateful for the people around me who can lead the way, show me and others what possibility looks like, what 6 months or a year down the line look like, and just do that in an authentic manner, and then me following suit to try to like play catch up with those folks who really set the bar.
Hmm. Yeah. I've actually had a couple other guests on the podcast who are runners with prosthetics. And one thing I find interesting is just like the different sort of scenarios where, and you can tell me if I'm off base on this, but from my understanding, like if you have a like below knee prosthetic, that's maybe a little bit better because you still maintain the knee joint.
Mm-hmm.
And then above that is obviously you lose the knee joint. So you have another kind of hurdle to get over with your running mechanics.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can also even have just like a total leg removal where it's like almost a whole, the prosthetic is like a socket that, or like a sort of like a, I don't know what, like a cradle that you kind of would put what would be the socket of your leg in, or the ball of the leg into the socket type of area. And from what I'm told is like, there's those key points that are kind of like the more you can preserve of those, that typically the better. But yours is above knee, correct?
That's correct. And that's a great generalization and summary of, the longer the limb, the better outcomes you'll have to be a runner or just able to ambulate day to day.
Hey folks, just a quick reminder that this podcast sponsors include S Fuels. They have a 15% offer for you. Element Electrolytes, they have a free sample pack offer for you. John G Apparel has 10% off. And Delta G Ketones has a 20% off and free consultation offer for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So when you first got the prosthetic, was there any sort of like strategy that you had where you're thinking at that point, okay, first I learned to walk with this, then I get comfortable with that, then I can start to jog? Was there I'm guessing maybe the people you're working with had some sort of a like timeline where they said, like I just think of like if I come back from like surgery or something like that, they'd probably say, well, don't go for a run the next day, maybe do this first.
Yeah, and you
Like,
totally ignore all of that, right?
Right. Yeah. How much of it did you ignore, Adam?
Yeah, I had an interesting recovery because I also broke my femoral neck in my hip, and I had like a screw in my femoral neck, and then I had necrosis in my femoral head, which was basically the bone not receiving enough blood supply. So my bone was dying. The femoral neck was broken. I had 2 screws in my femoral neck and head, a rod down my femur. So all that being said, I had a different outlook than some of the other people. And mainly that meant weight bearing or the delay of wearing a prosthetic. So there was a progression and a step that they put most people on, but it's kind of dependent on their specific scenario or case. Yeah, and for me, it felt forever. I think it was like 4 months before I wore a prosthetic, which seems like a long time when you're watching other people who got there after you start to walk and you're frustrated. But in the whole scheme of things, like what's an extra week or two to make sure it's done right? So for me, I had all those breaks, and basically I started wearing a prosthetic, and they put me on this table where I would only bear like 60% of my weight. And then, a week later I could bear like 70% of my weight. And then a week later I would bear. So it was a gradual increase until those bones healed. And then, it's walking with a walker, and then walking with crutches, and then walking with a cane, and then walking on your own. And it's a pretty slow progression early on. And then basically I spent a year there in PT perfecting that. And at the time I wanted to try to do everything I could before. So that included running, which even though I hated it before, I wanted to at least try it out. But because of those issues I mentioned earlier, specifically the necrosis in my femoral head, they said no high impact sports for you. So I skied and I scuba dived and I cycled. But really my running career and journey stopped basically like May or June of 2008 after my injury.
Yeah, I would imagine too, it's not just like, oh, I got to figure out how to use this prosthetic. It's also like from the timeline that you're removed from really doing any sort of like rigorous activity, certainly with your lower half of your body, you're also retraining every muscle in your leg that is still fully intact, the muscles that are in the leg that has the prosthetic on it. So you really are sort of starting kind of from square one from an atrophy standpoint, just in general. So when you first did kind of start getting, I guess, comfortable just having the prosthetic and thinking about running, did you think like, all right, my goal is to do an ultra marathon, or was it just like any type of running I'll take as a win, and then once we get that, I'll start building from there?
Yeah, not in a million years. I didn't even know about ultra marathoning until maybe a year and a half after after I started running. My goals early on were, and that's a great observation too, because for me, my running with a prosthetic came 7 years after wearing a normal day-to-day walking leg. And, if we go back to that progression of crutches, walking, and then walking freely without any support, you are retraining all that. And for 7 years, I trained how to walk with a normal day-to-day walking prosthetic. And then when I got into running 7.5 years later, I put on my running prosthetic for the first time, and it felt completely abnormal to me. And I was having to relearn that process of running with this very lightweight, unstable, unsafe running blade. Whereas, for 7 years, I walked on a microprocessor knee that had a computer in it, and it was very smart. It helped your gait. It helped if you took a misstep. And it just was ingrained in me to walk that way. And now 7.5 years later, I'm putting on this very unstable running blade. And, a win for me, and I love how you put wins, because those small wins really, they were just felt so incredible at the time of putting this on. And my first day I spent in what they call a solo step. So it's a harness connected to the ceiling, and you run around a 200-meter track. And if you fall, it catches you. And my gait looked really weird. I was like skipping at first and trying to my brain was working overtime on how to work this thing, because I'd worked another muscle memory for 7.5 years. And I kind of got the hang of it after maybe an hour. And then, it was take it home, and then you don't have this support, this harness anymore. And it's going out and going in a parking lot for me and trying to figure it out on your own and reinvent that muscle memory, which took a long process. And then a small win for me was running a 3-mile race 6 weeks later. And that's what my early years looked like. And early weeks looked like. And like I said, I worked up to a marathon, and then I was like, that's it. That's what runners do. That's the ultimate pinnacle. And then I found out about ultra marathoning.
It's there's more to this, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah. And am I right? You were the first 100-mile finisher with a prosthetic. Am I getting that right?
Above knee. So as you mentioned earlier,
Gotcha,
the distinction between below knee and above knee, there had been I say several, but a handful of below knee amputees. Chris Moon, Dave Mackey lost his leg after, but Chris Moon did Badwater, and there's another guy who did Badwater. back in the 90s, and then Amy Winters. And, you know, there's maybe 5 or 6 below knee amputees. And then during my research, I was really trying to reach out to those folks to understand what it's like and how to be successful running those distances as an amputee. And I couldn't find any other above knee amputees, but those people who I just mentioned really provided me a lot of good information and feedback and resources to be successful when I started trying to accomplish this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and another big step in kind of figuring out what it is you're gonna try to challenge yourself with, I imagine, would be kind of stepping off the road. So like I've been to JFK, as we were talking about before. I know what that Appalachian Trail section is like, and that must have taken some work, I would imagine, to get confident enough to want to sign up for a race like JFK, where that first 13 miles, you know, you go over the Appalachian Trail and there's some technical sections, some switchbacks in there. There's lots of rocks, unstable footing and things like that. Things that I would imagine just add a whole nother layer of complexity when you have a prosthetic. So what was that like? Did you get to like a marathon first before you ever got interested in trails, or was that something that kind of happened in parallel with your road running, your sub ultra road running anyway?
Yeah, similarly to what I mentioned earlier, I said no trail running for me early on in my process because, yeah, the roads, I worked up and the roads felt comfortable. And then if you're familiar with the North Face Endurance Challenge in DC, they have a 50-mile, I think a marathon and a 10K, maybe a half marathon too. But in 2017, my friends invited me to do the 10K there, and it's on trail. And I was like, no, thanks. That sounds horrible for all those reasons you just mentioned, right? It's the complexities of not being able to feel the ground, along with a mechanical knee that is not stable. And then, you know, roots and rocks and all those other added challenges. And I said, I will never do this. But, you know, as you embrace this growth mindset, I was kind of experiencing at the time. I slowly started to enter that world and try this out. And as you try things out, you get better at them, as I've learned over the years. And then fast forward to November of that year, I did Stone Mill 50 miler, and then JFK on subsequent weekends. And Stone Mill's got a little bit of elevation, but the rocks and roots there, I fell probably more than any ultra I'd ever fallen or ever done before. And then you get to JFK 6 days later and you're on the AT, as you mentioned. And I'm like, what did I get myself into? The technicality and rocks. And I said, never again am I going to do this. And the accumulative fatigue was building up and I was cramping and just having this like miserable time. And then finished JFK and long story short, I've been there 6 times since that first time, you know? So, I think, yeah, embracing these challenges and like learning and growing through them has kind of been this whole like journey of mine over the past 9 years. And JFK seemed super difficult in 2017. And now as I go back, I enjoy being there. I enjoy running on the AT, and I definitely enjoy getting off the AT and on that towpath.
Yeah, I bet. No kidding. I'm curious because I mean, with trail running, it's like it's not a question of whether you're gonna fall or not. It's like when am I gonna fall and how am I gonna respond to it?
Totally.
So like I'm just trying to wrap my head around like what it was like going out for some of those trail runs, knowing eventually I'm gonna trip on something and fall. Did you have any sort of experience that would have like maybe highlighted like what that was going to be like and what you were going to do when it happened? Or was it sort of something you just had to wait for it to happen and then kind of figure it out for the first time and then start piecing together kind of strategies around those circumstances?
Yeah, it happened early in my road running training, as you can imagine, like learning this new skill. And I felt, I wouldn't say often, but occasionally when I was road running, you know, I think the tricky part is when you're trail running, you're often in very remote locations. So I never wanted to. My biggest worry was not falling and getting back up and keeping on going. That's typically like what I envisioned. My biggest concern is like, what if my prosthetic fails in this scenario, and I'm like so remote that somebody's having to like come get me out, or if I do fall and hurt myself, and then I'm just putting like people at risk. And I think about that on one hand, and on the other, like able-bodied runners have that happen too, right? So I think the biggest concern is, yes, I do probably fall more often, and you know, I've learned over the years to just get back up, check myself off, and check myself out, and keep going. But one thing I've had to worry about probably more than others is, what if I have an equipment failure and, I'm in the middle of nowhere, and how do I get out of this circumstance? So, I carried tools with me. One of my screws came loose at JFK one year, and luckily I had an Allen wrench with me to like tighten my knee back down. I've carried like different foot soles for technical or road running, and typically carry backup components for every race I go to.
Yeah. No, I would imagine there's there's enough variables and uncontrollables in ultra running in general, and then trail running usually adds more of those, and then you've got that whole other set of potential things that you'll have to manage along the way. Is there I guess maybe a timeline or distance where you have to like take the prosthetic off and do any sort of maintenance with just the way it's attached? Or is that something where, in best circumstances, I think of it like almost like a shoe change in ultra, where like I tell a lot of my coaching clients, like, you don't necessarily have to like change your shoes on a schedule, but if you feel like something's wrong and you have that option, it's one of those better to have it and not need it type of situations. Is that similar with a prosthetic? Are you switching that out during different phases of the race, or taking care of that area in any way?
Great observation and great analogy. So similar to probably what you mentioned, of each individual athlete you coach is different on the schedule. They might need to change or check in on their shoes. It's similar to me and other runners with amputation. So for me, I have an incredible system that, I can run 100 miles or 24 hours and have never taken my leg off to manage sweat or blisters or any skin breakdown or something similar to like the shoe changes you mentioned. I do check in with it to make sure, try to like head it off early, as you mentioned with other able-bodied runners. But for me personally, I just have a system that works really well for me. And I do talk to other amputees who do have to, their volume changes, which is a major concern. So, their leg volume will shrink. So then they have to add what they call like a sock or two to that to like fill out so it fits within the socket portion better. So there are those concerns, the breakdown, the blisters, the sweat, like all those concerns. But I've only experienced that one time in my career where I transitioned to a new socket and it just didn't fit well. And as you can imagine with the analogy of shoes, if you get a shoe and it doesn't fit well, you can throw those out and get another pair, and hopefully those are better. But for me, it's a little bit more of a medical process of getting that fitment right. And once it fits, it's great. But when you have to change it, it can be a challenge.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can imagine. So after you did JFK, or you said you did a couple 50 milers, when did you first think, all right, I think 100 miles is something I want to tackle?
Well, I kind of got my timeline out of sorts, but I did. So I started running in April 2015. I worked up to a marathon in November that year, Richmond Marathon. So within eight months. And then I thought, as I mentioned earlier, this is the pinnacle. This is like the top of the running, distances. And I thought that for a long time. And fast forward to the summer of 2017, I hadn't really been focused on training for anything. And I was on a service project in Chicago, and I met a lady who just was accepted to Leadville 100. And she was we're runners, right? And so she was like telling me about this race. And I was like, totally mind blown. Like, I had no idea. And then I was asking her about what her training schedule looked like and what her programming looked like. And she was telling me and walking me through this. And my mind was just like, what the heck? And that was the first time I learned of that in the summer of 2017. And then I went to work and did some research and was like, all right, what does the program look like? And, would I be able to do this program? And, over the next week after learning about this, I had this big goal of better understanding it, putting together a plan, picking a race on the calendar, and then working towards that plan to see how far I could get along into the plan. And, once I was about 3/4 of the way through it, I was like, all right, I'm going to sign up for the race now. It was Brazos Bend 100 in 2016. Again, I got my timeline off. Ran the marathon in 2015. The summer of 2016, I learned about the 100. And then in December 2016, I ran Brazos Bend, my first 100. And that was like 19 months from the day I strapped on my running prosthetic for the first time.
Wow, so you really didn't waste too much time getting into the 100 miler, I guess.
I jumped from Richmond Marathon to the 100 miler, yeah, with a little bit of with 13 months in between those.
Yeah. So that has to give you some confidence then, I guess, with some of the 50-mile stuff too, where it's like you've already done something twice as far. So coming
Totally.
down to that, it's probably more of a question of just terrain specifics because, Brazos is a little friendly. It's more like the towpath at
Totally.
JFK for that race, but it's twice as long. So there's just more time for something to go wrong on a course like that. So uh, yeah, that's really. The year you did Brazos, was the weather pretty good that year? Because it can get pretty sloppy out there some years.
Yeah, it was good that year in 2016. I went back in this year, this January, and it's originally in December. They had really bad rainy weather there, and they closed the park
Mhm.
down in December. So then they delayed the race by a month, and then January 6th came around, and it rained again and closed the park down. So they moved the venue to where they hold the Habanero 100, which is I don't know if you know anything about that race, but
Yeah.
hot, sandy, miserable. But it was in January, but not the typical Brazos course that you know that you know.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm familiar. We're in Austin, so I've actually been to both those courses a couple of times, so I'm familiar with the terrain. But yeah, the Brazos course would be a little nicer, I would imagine, for you in general, unless it gets really wet, in which case. But that could happen at the other course too. Is That's actually a question I was going to ask you about too. Is there some like considerations you have to make that are like outside of what any runner would do? Like, oh, if it's going to rain, I got to be more mindful of this, or this is now going to be something I have to be concerned with that I wouldn't have been otherwise.
Rain. I actually recently started resoling my prosthetic side with some Vibram soles. They come from a prosthetic manufacturer with a really basic road sole on it. And more recently, and they wear out pretty quickly within like 300 miles. So I go through a ton of them. But what I found recently is just pulling those off and then resoling them at a local cobbler here. But I think the other big thing, so that helps tremendously on the AT and the rainy sections. But I think the biggest thing me personally, that I have to keep an eye on is from a nutrition standpoint that might differ a little bit. And, I'm using more energy. So I have to stay on top of that a little bit better. And I can still only consume and absorb so much calories or whatever per hour, same as anybody else can. I'm just using it a little bit more than the normal able-bodied runner. So I don't know. I found that I got to stay on top of that or else it spirals pretty quickly.
Yeah, that actually is an interesting point too. Is like, I mean, like your efficiency is obviously going to be different with the prosthetic. So are you doing like a metabolic cart test to kind of determine anything about like your nutritional needs that you've been able to do specifically, or has that been just kind of trial and error figuring that out?
I've done some VO2 testing on the treadmill and like metabolic consumption rates on the treadmill. I don't know how that necessarily compares to what my able body self would be. There's a handful of like large studies out there that say we use, like amputees in general, use about 30% more energy and metabolic consumption. But I think the overall picture is it's a little bit more than the typical person, and also that I can still only consume and absorb the same amount as you might be able to. Because
Yeah.
there's just a little bit
hmm
consideration that I'm using more and just have to stay on top of it because I can only take in so much as well.
Yeah, your error margin from under fueling is just going to be a little tighter. Like, do you target a certain amount of like grams of carbohydrate per hour during? I guess it probably depends on the race distance and intensity to some degree, but do you have like a framework that you like to follow?
Yeah, I've been trying to play with that more recently because I know there's a lot of research that's came out within the past year or two of even bumping it up to 120 grams. So I've been trying
hmm
to play with that. And I think before I was probably under 80, which is, again, kind of points out to I need to stay on top of that more. But more recently, I've trying to push towards 120 grams, and it's hard for me. I don't know what your suggestions or what works for you or how much you do.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think like the way I look at it is like if you can get on a metabolic cart test and get an idea of the ratios of carbs to fats that
Mm,
you're metabolizing at the intensity that you're going to race at, then you can kind of start putting together at least some ballpark numbers of what number you'd maybe want to try to defend. And, like I think these big numbers like 120, I would say I mean, granted, you're skewing maybe up to 30% higher, so it may be that you would get up to that number from a need standpoint. But I would say most of the stuff I've seen that would get up to 120 is typically people overshooting what they actually need out of the hope that it's like there's maybe some potential like performance advantage outside of the actual like liver and muscle glycogen attributes to carbohydrate intake. And so they're like, well, a lot of this is born out of cycling. So like they get this scenario where these guys are looking for like fractions of a percent margin improvement to, move from like 10th to the podium or something like that. So for them, it's like getting from 100 grams to 120 grams could be that solution, even if their body only technically needed 100 grams or something like that. They're also cyclists. So like there's only been one person I've actually seen in the ultra running. I'm sure there's others that I'm just unaware of, but David Roche hit like 120 to 130 grams at Leadville for around 15 hours. And he said that he didn't think he'd be able to sustain that for much longer than 15 hours. So there's going to be like a timeline, which to some degree, like the longer you go, the lower the intensity is going to get, and then the less carbohydrates that is going to be required. So you can probably scale back enough and make it sustainable just by like the additional length taking some off. But to kind of go back to what I was saying is like, generally speaking, like if you could determine like what the intensity is you're going to race at, and then figure out roughly like how much energy you would be burning per hour there, you could probably ballpark like let's just say like it's a 50-50 split between fat and carbohydrate. And you're at a point where every hour your body is going to require 800 calories to just like keep that workload going, then like you would probably want to be targeting 400 calories per hour, which would be like roughly 80 grams or something like that. So yeah, so like the hard part with you is probably because normally I would look at this sort of through pace to some degree, because I would think it was someone who's covering, let's say someone's going like between 8 to 10 miles per hour. They're probably going to need like around 1,000 calories per hour from a workload standpoint. And then you can start running those numbers. But if you're like 30% higher at a given pace, then like essentially any pace you're doing, you're going to have to plug in what someone going like maybe a couple miles per hour faster than you would typically need. So you sort of have this scenario where whatever pace you are going, you need to fuel like the person going a couple miles per hour faster, but you're going to be out there longer because you're still not you're not going as fast. So then it's like, is there a threshold of digestive tolerance and things like that kind of come into play? So I think generally speaking, like, yeah, getting your gut prepared to be able to tolerate a lot is not a bad idea, because then it's another one of those things where if you have it and don't need it, that's probably better than not, or needing it, not having it, kind of a scenario with that sort of stuff. But I bet we could pin down your number. It would actually probably the bigger step would, or the next step would probably just be like determining what you're going to do. Because I would imagine for like the marathon versus the 100-mile, you're up in an intensity spectrum. And then is there like an efficiency change? Is that linear? Is that like 30% on top of any intensity, or does it get even greater the faster you go, or do you get maybe a little more efficient the faster you go? Those are other variables that would be interesting. That I don't know, that maybe you do, or maybe nobody does, and you could be the first person to figure it out.
Yeah, well, I think there's what you said about the shorter the event, the larger margin of error that you can have there. And then I also like what you said about training the gut, because that's what I was trying to do ahead of that 24-hour event I did in February. And again, it's been trial and error for me. So, I think before I was erring on the low side, and now I was trying to overshoot, as you mentioned, because the potential to use more and maybe have a little bit of excess if able to. But what I found out in practice through, I was doing the gut building, if you will, for 3 and 4 and 5 hours. But then when you get to that 7 or 8 or 10 hour mark that you mentioned with David Roach, that's when I was like, oh, this is too, like, I can't sustain this, similar to what he said at the 15-hour mark. Right. So I learned that through practice in February of that 24-hour event. And I got 8 or 10 hours in, and my gut was like, that is too much. And like back it down and just change a little bit there. But But so it's been,
Yeah.
it's been something I've enjoyed too, is like learning through experimenting, right? So we can write all this stuff down on paper and have like a good plan. But you don't really know until you put it into practice. And that's what I've done with the physical side, the mental side, the nutrition side, and trying to really pin down what works for me in specific scenarios. And we only learn through that trial and error portion, right? So we can have the best intentions
Yeah.
and best plans going into it, but putting it in
Yeah.
practice is a whole different ballgame.
I'm excited to announce that I launched a new group coaching option. So to go along with my personalized one-on-one coaching options and my pre-made plans that I have on my website at zachbitter.com, this year I'm starting a group of online endurance runners who want to work with me in a slightly different model. So if you're interested in checking that out, just head to my website at zachbitter.com, go to the coaching tab. From there, you'll be directed to the team coaching option, and you can sign up for that and get onboarded to join the group.
No doubt. Yeah. And the other thing too, like that you could consider would be if you did get to a point where like you were collecting the data and you got a number of like, okay, this is what I would require to optimally perform and from an intake standpoint. And it just was like, no matter how hard you tried, you just weren't getting that down. And that became like a hurdle to get over. I mean, fat oxidation rates are manipulatable through a variety of different things. So, like, you've probably more or less maximized your fat oxidation improvement from just training. So, like, it's not like you're going to be like, okay, well, I can pull that lever harder. It's like chances are you're probably already at that point in your career where your training has hit a spot where a whole lot more isn't going to move that too much. But you could lower your carbohydrate intake in your daily diet and try to increase your fat oxidation risk, because that would also skew the carbohydrate fat metabolism you'd have across the intensity spectrum to some degree. And I mean, people get kind of goofy with this topic sometimes where they think it's kind of all or nothing, and they'll be like, oh, go on a strict ketogenic diet or eat all the carbs in the world. And it's really kind of more of like also a spectrum. So like,
Totally.
let's say for example, you got on a metabolic cart, got the data, realized I'm just 10 grams per hour shy of what I would optimally want to get in. And I'm like, every time I try to jam that much more in, I get a digestive issue, or it's just not something that's working. You could probably move the needle enough with just like a pretty minor carbohydrate reduction on top of or compared to what you're typically doing to shift that fat oxidation just to a minor degree versus a massive degree. Because you'd want to avoid any trade-offs that could potentially happen from being too aggressive with that approach too. But yeah, I mean, this is the fun part about the sport, right? It's like there's the variables that we kind of have some data on, but it's sort of extrapolated forward when you get into 100-mile stuff. And then you get guys like David Roche like, well, I'll try 130 grams per hour. And then you get everyone else who's like, well, I'll try a ketogenic diet, or I'll try and then you get a lot of these kind of like anecdotes and case studies and things that are like kind of fun to kind of play around with at the end of the day.
Yeah, totally. And I did try to do that strict like ketogenic diet and a lot of fasted runs back in 2017 when I was doing a lot of low intensity and higher volume stuff, which I was still new in my career. And to your point, like building out that aerobic capacity, which worked well at the time. But then when you start adding more intensity, I had to go see a dietitian because I was just hitting the wall. And she was like, well, you need to start taking carbs in during your first workout of the day if you're going to work this hard over, have this much intensity built into your programming. And that was like news was a news flash to me. And I'm like, it makes total sense now. But, coming from where I was at of just running slow and not taking in a ton of carbs, or if any at all, to doing higher intensity stuff and built like already having that fat oxidation and aerobic capacity, as you mentioned, was just a huge shift in learning experience the farther down in my career I got. So
yeah. I mean, my experience too is like if you have like a background in like a lower carb ketogenic diet too, like when you do start bringing some carbohydrate back, it at least at first, depending on how much you stretch that back up, like it feels like it's pretty potent.
yeah,
So
I agree.
so it's like you're like, wow, this is like rocket fuel. And then like you said, if you're transitioning from like a lower intensity base building phase of training into like a speed work development phase, or you're going to do a race that is a little more glycolytic, then it becomes this really potent tool. But yeah, I did want to kind of ask you about that too, because like your training progression, you started out just doing a lot of low intensity stuff, and then you eventually decided to add speed work. And what was that like, kind of the transition into doing speed work? Did you have any sort of experience with more explosive stuff that let you know like this is something I can do, or was that all kind of like I hope this works type of an approach and kind of playing around with it to see?
Yeah, when I first started my running journey in 2015, I didn't know anything about the sport, and I got connected with a triathlon training team in the DC area, and their main focus was heart rate training. So most of their work was like low intensity, and which worked great for me at the time because I had no aerobic base. The hardest part about running for me wasn't wearing a prosthetic um, or my skin and everything was built up for the prosthetic, being able to wear the prosthetic for a long time, but I hadn't done anything aerobic in the past 7 years. So I had zero base. I was like, would run 10 minutes and be completely wiped, exhausted. So really falling into their programming around heart rate and low heart rate and zone 2 training, I just started to see really big jumps quickly, from 5 and 10K in April, May of 2015 to a marathon and running pretty decently. And I did my only speed work, I guess, during that time was entering races and doing a half marathon or a 10-mile run. For the most part, I was just running really slow, which it was working at the time. But then I hit a wall probably around 2017, 18. And once I started to build in speed work, then interval work, threshold work, that's when kind of those two worlds kind of came together to really get past that wall I was experiencing, the time, bettering my times and becoming faster. So that's kind of what the progression looked like. A lot of low intensity, higher volume for probably 3 years, and I was able to get better doing that. And then it wasn't until the past couple of years where I really started to focus on more intense workouts and building the other systems. There are other anaerobic systems that bounce me past that kind of block I was experiencing.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have thought of this had you not mentioned the energy difference, but that makes me wonder if like there is also like a kind of like a threshold difference for you too, where you have like maybe not a threshold difference in terms of like you're still going to cross over an aerobic threshold, a lactate threshold, hit your VO2 max and things like that. But I wonder, is the duration at which you're able to maybe build up to and sustain those intensities different at all compared, like when you're working with the other triathletes? Was there like a mismatch there in terms of what they would normally target versus what they would kind of start you with, or was there just like a battery of field tests and things you would do to kind of determine that?
I mean, I think for that example specifically, it was all based on max heart rate and percentage of max heart rate. So I think for me, it wasn't necessarily paces, but if I was hitting 75%, 78, 80% or less, that was kind of my ballpark of what my zone 2 would look like. So I think, to your point of the paces, my paces probably are much different than what it would look like for those other athletes. But since we were working specifically on heart rate, I felt like especially keeping that in check for that zone 2 run was probably similar to my able-bodied peers.
Sure.
And
yeah. And then from there, oh, sorry, I didn't mean to
no,
interrupt you.
totally. And what I was going to say, and that's what I based it off on for, years and years. And now it's less about heart rate and more about those paces you mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like heart rate and perceived effort just in general, because then it's like from there you can kind of look at pace as a moving target, and that can kind of determine whether you're heading in the right direction or not. Where, your 70% of max heart rate and what that feels like isn't going to change drastically. And then from there, it's like, well, what is my pace doing in similar conditions at that? And if it's getting faster, then you're doing something right. So
right. Which, like I said, I was totally new to the sport, and I think it was a good entry point into kind of learning some of this, and probably what I needed at the time is a lot of like slow volume and aerobic building at the time.
Yeah, absolutely.
It was garbage to be frank.
Yeah. I do want to take a little bit of time here just to kind of take a glance at just like what you've all done and kind of maybe what you have coming up too, because I mean, we talked about JFK and the 100 mile you've done, but I mean, you've got like on top of being the first above knee prosthetic 100 mile finisher, you've also got like a few Guinness World Records. Can you just tell us a little bit about some of like the big achievements that you've hit on over your running career?
Yeah, I mean, I think
And
sorry, go ahead. What was the?
I was just gonna say, and triathlon, I guess too.
Yeah, I mean, it feels crazy to think about it 10 years later, especially like uh, flashing back to that early running with the harness around the hospital track. But yeah, 2016 was kind of that first 100 miler, that first big achievement. I would call that of a breakthrough achievement for me, and I was super proud of that. And then from there, it just kind of started to get better with better training, better coaching, and really in 2020, I ran Tunnel Hill in under 19 hours for the 100 mile, which again was like, wow, what's next? And then in February of this year, I ran a 24-hour race and got my 100 mile down to 16 hours and 13 minutes. So it's just been this kind of crazy progression of lowering that time over the years. So that's been a cool, big achievement of mine. But I think just all the other progression I made, like over the short amount of time, seems equally as cool for me, because again, looking back to 2015, I never knew what an ultramarathon was, right? It was like,
Yeah.
it took me a year to even like realize what this stuff was. And then once I jumped in and I saw like my hard work paying off, I just kind of kept progressing to the point I am now. And, what this past year has looked like was, January this year, I did that Brazos spin, as we mentioned. And then 6 weeks later, I did the 24-hour, which that 100-mile time, and then Boston Marathon and saw lower times there. And then the London Marathon and saw lower times there. And it's just like, what's next? Like, what else am I capable of? And how long have I been limiting myself with training and mental training and all the things that are leading up to kind of where I'm at now? So it's been a cool journey. This year has been one of the best yet. And, you mentioned a little bit about triathlon, and I think that's helped me get here too, because I was so focused on, for a year and a half, making the Paralympics and competing in triathlon. And it wasn't necessarily a passion of mine. I did it because there was competitive opportunities. But once that transition happened from realizing it was almost causing burnout in a sense, and I realized that in September last year, and then came back to my passion of running and pursuing running in this community, I've just seen my whole life, both on the course and off the course, change.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think I always get excited when someone's targeting fast 100 milers and having that be a goal. But it sounds like you're still improving. So like that's got to be exciting to be able to kind of focus on not just one distance, but just knowing that like whatever you pick to do next, you have the opportunity to do it faster yet than you have in the past, and you haven't necessarily kind of hit that ceiling at any point.
Yeah, and I think, yes. And what I would say is, I'm getting older now too, so I know those days are going to come where I'm going to start slowing down, and I'm trying to also realize, like, again, the immense gratitude I have for being able to go out and just do this thing that I thought I couldn't do for a long time. So yes, there's a competitive side of it too, but there's also like this longevity point of realizing the ability to just go out and run where, just a few years ago, I didn't think that was possible. So embracing that while I can.
We do almost have too many options where like you run out of time to be competitive before you've really squeezed everything out of all of them. So
Right.
it is kind of like, which ones do I really want to figure out how fast I can actually go at and kind of focus a little bit more specifically on it. But I'm cheering for a sub 16-hour 100 mile for you.
I would love it. I think I could get there as long as I do it in the next like year or two. I think I could potentially get there, but
Yeah. Although you might have a little longer timeline with the 100 miler, so maybe the marathon is the thing to take care of first.
Yeah, I just ran sub 3 there in like 10 days ago, so that was a big hurdle for me too, or a big
Wow.
threshold for me too. So
Where did you run it at?
That was at Washington State. There's a fast course up there called Tunnel Light, but I ran 308 in April of this year, and I was like, all right, if I get a full training block, I think there's potential to break 3 hours. And there have been maybe 6 amputees who have been able to do that, and it was kind of a big threshold for most people, but especially my community is kind of sets us apart, I guess, maybe.
Yeah, no doubt. Wow, that's incredible. So you took off over 8 minutes off your prior PR?
Yeah, 11.
Okay, wow. So yes, you probably still have some room. I would imagine. Most people who can drop 11 minutes off their prior PR haven't whittled it down quite yet. So
yeah,
what's the fastest?
Sorry, go ahead.
What's the fastest marathon for someone with an above knee prosthetic?
That's the fastest for a single leg above knee amputee. So
so you have it. Okay.
Yeah, I've owned that record since it was, probably like 320s. But really, when I applied the first time, I was at 313 in like 2019, 2020. And then since then, I've lowered it like 4 or 5 times. Been brought it down from 313 to 257. Man, there was just something you just said I was going to follow up on, and I forgot. I'm sorry.
Oh, how much further you can lower because you just had an 11-minute PR?
Yeah, so there's a little bit of trickery going on there, because the one I ran in May was after 2 100-milers and then a marathon within 10 weeks. So I had a lot of cumulative. I literally ran Boston Marathon on Monday, and then my fastest time was that next Saturday, 308 in London 6 days after that. So there were like 200 milers and then a marathon. And then I went out and ran that marathon, which was so, all things aside, like taking out that cumulative fatigue heading into that race, I probably could have ran a little bit faster. So it's not necessarily 11 minutes, but that's what it says on paper.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I mean, you've got the fastest time already, so any improvement on that just makes you even faster yet.
Yeah, that's right. Now it's time to focus on maybe some of those other events like you mentioned.
Yeah, it'd be fun to see like how fast you could run a 50-miler at like a Tunnel Hill type course, and how much faster you could get your 100-miler and that sort of stuff too. So
Totally.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Awesome, Adam. Well, why don't you let the listeners know kind of where they can find you, if you've got anything exciting coming up? All the stuff, socials, website, and that type of thing.
Totally. So I have a website. It's just my name, adampopp.com. And from there, kind of links out to my professional services and then my running career. Also Instagram's EOD Popp on Instagram. And then kind of what's coming up next for me is in 19 days, I'm going to run 24 hours on a treadmill and try to carry some of those road and trail running records over to the treadmill, which, I think maybe you have some experience there as well. So any feedback you want to give me on that, I'd love to pick your brain. But
yeah, I haven't gone 24 on a treadmill, but I have gone 100 miles in, I think it was 1209. And, the thing that I found, it's just another level of kind of monotony, but you can distract yourself pretty well. So like, I think people, when they get on these longer treadmills, they think that's going to be the biggest hurdle. The biggest hurdle I found is when you're running even on like a short loop track or a real boring kind of one-dimensional type area, you're still in control. So you like make these like micro adjustments all the time. So even if your splits are really even, you're still kind of like controlling that with micro adjustments.
Totally.
When you're on the treadmill, you're just responding to it. So it's almost like you're being told what to do the whole time. And for me, that was actually like a bigger kind of angst than anything, where I would feel after a while, it was just like, I just had this like drive to want to get off of it. And you can sort of like, you can kind of manipulate that a little bit by just changing the pace frequently. So like whatever your tolerability to that is, I would say like, rather than going in there thinking like, I'm going to pick this pace and set it and forget it, you can do that when it's tolerable. But I would say like, keep an open mind about just like using that, like whatever your target pace is, going up, above, and below it, just so you kind of feel like you kind of have that semblance of control with the pacing a little bit more. Another thing I did that you got to be careful with this, and just because treadmills only have such long of a bed, but you can sort of also manipulate that by, if you have the same pace, just letting yourself kind of drift back a little bit and then like speeding up a little bit. So you're going kind of the front to the back of the treadmill, that sort of kind of gives you that same perception of like kind of those micro adjustments, even though you're covering the same distance. Yeah, weird little things like that. But I did a lot of like music, some podcasts. We were live streaming it, and I had like a bunch of guest speakers coming in. So I actually tuned into some of those for like a good chunk of it too, because it's fun to hear people talking about, what they were up to and other things like that. So distractions are good. Being mindful of that kind of difference between doing like just having that natural pace fluctuation and having to kind of like control it a little bit more are definitely the big ones. Oh, the other one is like test your fluid loss on a treadmill before, because whatever temperature feels decent is probably going to feel a little more humid as you get going, because you sort of build like this. I mean, the bigger the room you can get and the more fans you can get, the better, because then you're just blowing the heat away from you. But if you have, I did mine during the pandemic, so I was sort of relegated to a small room, and essentially what happened was like I got this like microclimate of my own like sweat and humidity around me. So yeah, and it was in Phoenix too, so like the outside temperature was like 100 degrees. And we had the air conditioner on full blast, set down to like whatever the lowest the thermostat would let it get, and it was still like above 80 degrees in the room.
Your body was cooking it.
Yeah. The more you can manipulate, like, or try to like manipulate the environment through like open space, big fans and things like that, the better you're going to be able to probably control that. But regardless what your setup is, like if you can get an idea of just kind of like fluid loss and stuff like that by testing your sweat loss rate on the treadmill, that's probably some useful information to kind of build out the hydration side of it.
Yeah, cool. I appreciate that. I appreciate that feedback. It's a good point about changing up the monotony of it by pacing too. I love that, because as you mentioned, I did that. My best maybe experience is running 24 hours on a track, how this might relate. And yeah, to your point, you can just kind of like pull over or walk or whatever. And you have a lot of flexibility there, even though it's on a very controlled environment. Whereas especially starting and stopping the treadmill for me as an above knee amputee, like trying to get going with the belt and all that other stuff is miserable. So my plan is to not try to stop as much.
Yeah.
And to your point,
you can limit it.
Yeah. If I can limit it, all the better. So,
And you said that's in 19 days?
Yeah. October 15th, which is a Tuesday. I'm doing it at, the Hoka flagship store in New York City on Fifth Ave.
Oh, sweet.
Yeah. On Fifth Ave. So, with an organization called Achilles International. And yeah, they've really, supported me over the past 10-ish years of my running journey. And they help athletes with disabilities across the nation and world, really pursue marathoning and distance running. So, they're based out of New York. They've kind of come together to put this event on. And I think hopefully I could show up and do them proud.
Yeah, no, it sounds exciting. Is there a live stream for it that people can tune in at?
Yeah, we're going to do a live stream, and the official announcement has been delayed. But they're going to announce it, I think, on October 1st. So maybe around the same time this podcast comes out, but there are going to be some links around that on how to get involved if you're in the city, or live stream if you want to join there, or just take part if you're local as well. So they're
right on. Well,
I was just going to say they're going to have another treadmill where people can come and run with me again to kind of break up that monotony. And they're going to have hand cycles there for people who can't necessarily run or ambulate, hand cycles and push rims. So people of all abilities can kind of come in and support and maybe do a workout and join in on some of the fun.
Yeah. Everyone watching will have fun. You will maybe have bouts of fun.
That's right.
Well, that's cool that you'll have people be able to join in with you out there. So cool. Oh yeah, I'll be sure to keep an eye open for the announcement and then put the links in that in the show notes. So if people want to check in and see how you're doing during that 24 hours, they'll have access to that.
Yeah.
And then New Yorkers head over.
Yeah, please do. The more people, the better. The more support, the better. Help me take my mind off of that monotony, as you mentioned. And I was going to ask one question about your treadmill run. Did you have issues with it overheating or having to get off and take into account the limits of the treadmill you were running on?
Yeah. Actually, we had quite a few hurdles that kind of weren't maybe as apparent to the viewer. That in hindsight, I'm like thankful we actually got the thing off the ground. It's like it started actually with I was just like I was going to be doing this 100-mile track race over in London called Centurion 100,
Mm.
and the pandemic came, so everything got canceled, and I was like maybe 4 or 5 weeks out from that race, so I had done most of the training. So I'm like, well, what's the most specific thing to a track that I could still do? So I was like, well, I'm just going to throw up a YouTube stream and get on a treadmill and do it for 100 miles, and then like I told my sponsors about it, and they were like, let's just make this bigger, and it just like spiraled into this like production essentially. So they ended up bringing in 2 treadmills that I had, and I could go from each. So we were monitoring the distance separate from the screen on the treadmill.
Hmm.
And so we had like the engineers in there to calibrate, because like, these treadmill records get like really complicated because there's all sorts of things you're supposed to do. So like had I done it my original way, it wouldn't have been official at all. And technically, I don't know that mine was official because I didn't have it open to public because of the pandemic. But there were people there. There was an engineer there. The treadmills were calibrated. All that stuff was taken care of. But the biggest issue we had was we had so much power running through that room with the live streaming equipment, the air conditioner. We had a separate unit air conditioner, the 2 treadmills, that one of them would power off. So I'd be running there, and in the beginning, the machine wouldn't turn off, the screen would just go blank.
Hmm.
So I think it was like maybe within the first 10 miles, the screen went blank, and I didn't notice it for like maybe 2 or 3 minutes. So I lost a little bit of like distance there where I was still running, but the machine wasn't tabulating anything for us to record.
Yeah.
So as soon as I noticed that, I jumped to the extra one, and then we started that one up, and they fixed that one. But then when I would switch to that one, the reason we had 2 was just for a scenario like that, but also because these treadmills, they were set up where they were going to power down automatically after 3 hours, and there was no way to override that. So the plan originally was every 3 hours I'd switch treadmills just to eliminate the shutdown and repower up, so I wouldn't be standing there for like minutes waiting for that to happen. I could just hop over and a couple seconds later get going again. And it ended up being just something where we needed the second one because the other one was powering in and out. But eventually we solved that problem. We realized it was just that we were running too much power to that side of the house. We ran an extension cord. This was during the event too. I'm on the other treadmill. I tell my wife to close, like, there's a 100-foot extension cord in the shed. Can you go get it and try plugging it in on the other side of the house? Let's see if that fixes it. And that did it. So we must have been on like a different circuit breaker or something like that.
Yeah.
Because it worked fine after that, and I was able to use both machines. But it was a little like kind of that first like 30 miles or so, there was a lot of kind of like, is this going to even end up working?
Yeah, right. And punches is like what you become good at, right? So,
yeah,
being able to adapt to those challenges in the moment is kind of what performance is in a lot of cases. And yeah, similar to what you just mentioned, is working through all those like calibrations and everything of witness statements and measurements and all that. And I just did a local run just to like get all that together to make sure it's right. So when you submit it, so we're doing that ahead of the October event, just on a very small scale to make sure all that's in line. But there's so many things that I've learned through this process, just reading the rules and the guidelines. It's always great to get feedback from someone like yourself of how it works in reality,
Yeah. Because I don't think people realize how many details they go in, which it makes sense when you think about it though, because if you just jump on a random treadmill, like without it being calibrated, those things can be off by quite a bit. Like if you go to although commercial gyms are probably good at like keeping their machines up to date and calibrated, but if you have like a treadmill that you use at home and you don't have it like serviced very often, and then you go on another one, you can tell like the difference in effort, especially if you're watching heart rate, because it's so controlled too. You set it's like 8 miles per hour or something like that, and you look at your heart rate and you're like, well, on this machine, my heart rate's 10 beats per minute higher than the other one.
Yeah.
There's clearly something off between the two. So yeah, there's all sorts of kind of goofiness. But I think having a second treadmill is a good idea just in case. Because if you have a mechanic on hand and then something goes wrong, they'll be able to fix it. But if it takes them 15 minutes to fix it, that's a fair amount of moving time that you miss out on.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I learned a lot over the past couple of weeks, like leading into this, and I know just similar to your experience, there's going to be something that pops up, but I'm going to have a good team there to hopefully help me work through it.
Yeah, you'll crush it. It'll be fun to watch. I'm excited to follow along.
Yeah, cool.
Awesome, Adam. Well, thanks a bunch for your time and sharing your story. It's it's always motivating to hear about not just people running crazy races as fast as you have, but doing them after all the circumstances that went into you even finding the sport. So, I appreciate you coming on the show.
Yeah, very grateful to be here, and thanks for having me.
All right, take care, Adam.
Yeah, you too. Thanks.
Here are some discounts and promos for HPO sponsors. Also, just a reminder, I have a full breakdown of how I use each of these products at the end of the episode, so stick around to hear that if interested. Otherwise, head over to the websites. S-Fuels, if you're interested in right fuel at right time approach, check out their second generation products that just launched. You can get a 15% discount by heading to their site. Also, if you want to try a free sample pack for the cost of shipping, there is a link in the show notes and on the episode landing page that will get you access to that. Otherwise, head over to sfuelsgolonger.com. Janji Apparel has 10% off with promo code BITTER10. Janji makes some great training apparel. I use it in the gym and on runs. You also have a really cool product I've been using a lot lately, which is their multi-pass mini and sling bag. I would definitely recommend checking those out. Element Electrolytes has a free sample pack with a purchase of their product and a satisfaction guarantee, which just means if you don't like it, you get your money back, no questions asked. You don't even have to return the product. They also just launched a new product called Sparkle, which is a 16-ounce carbonated can with the element flavors in it. This one's great. I've been using it in my long runs recently. Delta G Ketones has 20% off with promo code BITTER20, and they also offer a free consultation to help you better understand how their product would maybe fit your lifestyle and figure out what protocol would be best with that. So head over to deltagketones.com to check out their products and access that discount. Thanks for tuning into this episode of the Human Performance Outliers podcast with Zach Bitter.